On a frozen morning in late December 1944, the Ardennes forest lay silent under snow and ice. Along a narrow road leading toward the Belgian town of St. Vith, a column of armoured vehicles, including Panzer IV tanks from the elite Führer Begleit Brigade, moved forward with calm confidence. They believed this would be an easy win, just another push in a counter-offensive that seemed to be rolling everything aside. Then, in a single moment, that confidence went up in flames. The lead tank exploded in a massive fireball, so powerful that its 8-ton turret was blown clean off, spinning through the air like a thrown coin before crashing upside down into the snow. Before the crews could react, another tank detonated. Then another. The sound was wrong. It was deeper and heavier than anything the German veterans had heard before, like the ground itself was being torn open. The attacker was invisible, hidden somewhere inside the thick pine forest. With each heavy blast coming from inside the forest, another German tank in the column was hit and knocked out. So what was killing them? The answer made no sense at all. It was a 105mm howitzer mounted on a self-propelled carriage, the M7 Priest. This was artillery, designed to fire shells in high arcs over distant hills from miles behind the front lines. It was not designed mainly to fire straight ahead or to fight tanks at close range, because it was built for indirect fire far behind the front lines, and absolutely never meant to act like a giant rifle. American doctrine was clear. This should not work. The armor was thin. The top was open. The 105mm shells were mainly high explosive rounds, not specialized armor-piercing ammunition, but at close range their blast could still destroy tanks in other ways. In direct combat, the M7 was not a weapon. It was a death trap. But war does not always follow manuals. Cut off on the wrong side of a collapsing front line, carrying the wrong weapon for the job, American artillery crews made a decision no training book had prepared them for. They would break every rule. They would hide in the forest like ghosts. They would turn artillery into ambush hunters and fire not by doctrine, but by survival. What happened next did more than shock hardened German veterans. It bought critical time for the defense of St. Vith, and it became a case that military historians would later study when discussing how armies fight under extreme pressure. The day artillery became invisible executioners, and the wrong weapon became exactly the right answer. To understand the shock that rippled through the German tank crews that morning, you need to understand who they were and what they had already survived. The Führer Begleit Brigade traced its origins to Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment. The Führer Begleit Brigade traced its origins to Hitler's military escort units, which were responsible for protecting him at forward headquarters and during movements near the front. By December 1944, the unit had been expanded into a combined arms brigade with Panzerreifus, assault guns, and mechanized infantry. But that core identity remained. These men saw themselves as the Führer's chosen sword, the iron elite of the Wehrmacht. Many soldiers in the brigade were veterans of the Eastern Front, and while only a few may have experienced the fighting connected to Stalingrad, many had survived later battles shaped by the same brutal conditions of that front, had endured the grinding attrition around Kursk, had learned the brutal lessons that only the Russian front could teach. They knew what real combat looked like, had faced Soviet T-34s and massed artillery barrages, and had lived to tell about it. In their estimation, the Americans were barely soldiers, wealthy amateurs with good equipment, but no real stomach for the kind of total war that Germany had been fighting since 1941. December 1944 seemed to confirm their contempt. Hitler's Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16th through the snow-heavy forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, had achieved stunning initial success. American units, many of them green troops resting in what they thought was a quiet sector, had been shattered or scattered. The 106th Infantry Division, caught on exposed ground, had surrendered thousands of men. Roads that had been peaceful one day were burning with American vehicles the next. For the German tankers, it might have felt like the glory days returning, 1940 all over again, when panzers had raced across France and the world had trembled. Their Panzer IV tanks were well maintained and adequately supplied. The brigade relied mainly on Panzer IV tanks and assault guns, and although a small number of newer Panther tanks were operating in the wider offensive. At the start of the offensive, they had fuel and ammunition available for immediate operations, and this gave them early momentum, even though serious supply shortages would soon limit their advance. The road to St. Vith lay open before them. The town was more than just another Belgian crossroads. It was a critical junction where multiple supply routes converged, the kind of position that could determine whether the German offensive continued or stalled. Intelligence suggested that American resistance in the area was crumbling, units withdrawing in disorder, defenses fragmenting under pressure. The Panzer column advanced in good order that morning, tanks spaced roughly 50 yards apart on the icy road, commanders standing in their turrets despite the cold, because visibility mattered more than comfort in forested terrain like this. They scanned the woods with binoculars, alert for the familiar threats. The boxy silhouette of a Sherman tank, the low profile of an American tank destroyer, the telltale glint of sunlight on an anti-tank gun's barrel. They saw only silent forest and falling snow. The Germans expected to encounter Shermans. They expected to face Sherman tanks, which German soldiers later referred to as Ronsons because of their tendency to catch fire, a reputation that grew stronger in post-war accounts, because, as the grim joke went, they lit the first time, every time. They might face some M10 or M36 tank destroyers with their powerful guns, and those were threats to be respected. But these were known enemies with known capabilities. Predictable. The German crews had trained against these threats, had developed tactics to counter them, and had confidence born of experience. What they couldn't have anticipated, what fell completely outside their tactical assumptions, was that they were about to be ambushed by weapons that had no business being there, used in ways that violated every principle of sound artillery doctrine. The M7 Priest had been designed for one specific job, and fighting tanks wasn't it. Its official designation, 105mm howitzer motor carriage M7, told you everything about its intended purpose. It was a howitzer designed to fire high-arcing shots over obstacles, dropping shells on targets miles away that the crew couldn't even see. It was motor-driven, and it was built on the M3 Lee tank chassis, and later versions used the M4A3 Sherman chassis, so it could move across rough ground. And it was a carriage, a platform to move the gun where it was needed, not a fighting vehicle meant to engage in direct combat. The name Priest was a British nickname, and it came from the .50 caliber machine gun ring that looked like a small church pulpit. .50 caliber machine gun mount that rose from the right side of the open crew compartment. That machine gun was meant for local defense against enemy infantry, nothing more, because the M7 was never supposed to get close enough to the enemy to need anything else. Everything about the design reflected this rear area mission. The armor was minimal. Its armor was light for an artillery vehicle, and in some areas it was about 12mm, while other parts were thicker. But overall, it was not built to take direct anti-tank fire. Barely half an inch of steel, enough to stop shell fragments and rifle bullets, but nothing more substantial. A German armor-piercing round from any tank gun would slice through it as if it wasn't there. The crew compartment was completely open to the sky, which made sense for an artillery piece where the crew needed to work quickly and didn't expect incoming fire, but which meant that a single grenade, or even a determined rifleman, could kill everyone inside. The vehicle stood about 8 feet tall, and it was close to 9 feet when you counted the .50 caliber mount, so it could be easier to spot when visibility mattered. a massive target that would be spotted instantly on any battlefield where visibility mattered. The gun itself fired a 33-pound high explosive shell designed to fragment and destroy soft targets, bunkers, infantry positions, vehicles. The shell's muzzle velocity was only about 1,550 feet per second, respectable for an artillery piece, but far too slow for anti-tank work. Dedicated anti-tank guns needed to fire their projectiles at 2,500 or 3,000 feet per second to punch through heavy armor. Speed was everything when you were trying to crack steel plate. Doctrine was crystal clear on this point. M7 priests belonged miles behind the front lines, receiving fire missions from forward observers and sending shells arcing over the horizon toward enemy positions that might be 5 or even 7 miles distant. Crews trained endlessly in indirect fire, calculating angles, adjusting for wind and weather, achieving precision through mathematics rather than direct observation. Most of the time, they trained for indirect fire, and direct fire was not the M7's main job, even though the manuals still covered direct laying for special and dangerous situations. Doctrine treated the M7 fighting tanks at close range as high risk, and it was usually something to avoid, but the battlefield sometimes forced crews into it. It is not equipped for this role and will be destroyed. But in late December 1944, as the German Ardennes offensive tore through American lines, doctrine and reality diverged catastrophically. The artillery units attached to the 7th Armored Division had deployed to what was supposed to be a quiet sector, prepared to provide standard fire support, lobbing shells at distant German positions supporting infantry advances, the normal routine of field artillery. Within days of the offensive beginning, that quiet sector had become a maelstrom. Infantry positions evaporated. Tank destroyer units were knocked out or withdrew to form new defensive lines. Communication networks collapsed in the chaos. And suddenly, the artillery crews looked up to realize that the front line they were supposed to be supporting, the line that was supposed to be miles ahead of them, no longer existed. They had become the front line. One battery commander, perhaps a regular army captain who had taught gunnery by the book at Fort Sill in peacetime, faced an impossible choice. He could order withdrawal, abandoning the position and effectively handing St. Vith to the Germans on schedule. He could try to provide indirect fire support while German tanks rolled up and destroyed his vehicles one by one. Or he could attempt something so contrary to doctrine, so tactically unsound, that it had probably never been seriously discussed in any artillery school in America. He could fight. The decision might have been made in a freezing Belgian forest, the battery commander gathering his gun crews in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath making white clouds in the frigid air. He might have said something along these lines. The manual says we're not supposed to engage tanks directly. The manual was written by people who aren't here right now. We are. We're going to load for direct fire, position these guns in the woods like they're tank destroyers, and when those Panzers come down that road, we're going to hit them before they know we're there. The crews might have understood the implications immediately. This was likely a one-way mission. Their thin armor wouldn't stop return fire. Their high profile made concealment difficult. Their shells weren't designed for armor penetration, but the alternative was either death or retreat, and neither option was acceptable if there was any chance, however slim, that they could hold the position. The forest flanking the approach to St. Vith was dense with pine trees, branches heavy with accumulated snow. The ground was frozen hard, but the M7's tracked chassis could still maneuver carefully through the trees. The crews drove their vehicles deep into the woods, far enough from the road to avoid easy detection, but close enough for clear shots at any vehicles that passed. Then came the camouflage work. They cut pine branches and draped them over the high profile of each vehicle until it started to blend with the surrounding forest. Someone found white bedsheets, possibly from an abandoned Belgian farmhouse, and these were spread over the vehicles to break up the dark olive paint and merge with the snow-covered ground. Each M7 was positioned at an angle that would allow it to fire and then quickly reverse deeper into the forest. The crews identified secondary positions, places they could relocate to after firing, creating what would later be called a shoot-and-scoot pattern. They would fire 1 or 2 shots, then move before the enemy could fix their position and bring overwhelming return fire to bear. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. Hours passed in the numbing cold, sitting in those open-topped vehicles while temperatures dropped and the forest remained eerily silent. They kept engines off to avoid noise and telltale exhaust smoke. They maintained strict radio silence, communicating only through hand signals. Every man strained to hear the sound that would announce the enemy's approach. Then it came. The deep, rumbling growl of heavy engines, the mechanical thunder of big Maybach motors that powered German tanks. It was a sound that had acquired an almost mythical quality in its capacity to inspire dread, the sound that meant you were about to face the Wehrmacht's most dangerous weapons. The American crews tightened their grips on their guns and waited. The German column approached in the late morning of December 21st, 1944, or possibly earlier that day, when fighting around St. Vith was still ongoing, and elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade were moving along forest roads in an effort to break American resistance in the area. The lead vehicle was a Panzer IV, and its commander stood in the open turret, scanning the tree line through binoculars. He was searching for familiar threats, the angular shape of an American tank destroyer, the boxy profile of a Sherman, the distinctive outline of an anti-tank gun position. He saw nothing but snow-covered pines and morning shadows. In his camouflaged M7 Priest, positioned roughly 200 yards off the road with a clear view down the forest corridor, an American gunner watched as Panzer crawled across his sight picture. His hands might have been shaking, from cold, from adrenaline, from the sheer unreality of what he was about to attempt. He had trained for years to fire at targets he couldn't see, calculating trajectories and angles. Now he was aiming in direct fire, much closer than artillery crews were trained for, clearly able to see the outline of the tank through the trees. The battery commander, standing beside the gunner in the open crew compartment, watched and waited. This wasn't like indirect fire, where mathematics and coordinates dictated when to shoot. This was personal and immediate, looking at another human being through your sights and choosing to end his life. The commander's hand dropped. The M7's howitzer roared. The sound was unlike anything the Germans expected. Tank guns made a sharp, high-pitched crack when firing armor-piercing rounds. Anti-tank guns produced a similar penetrating snap. But the M7's howitzer made a deep, guttural, earth-shaking boom, the characteristic sound of artillery, the sound of big guns firing from distant positions, except this boom came from right there in the trees, practically on top of them. The 33-pound high-explosive shell crossed 200 yards in less than a second and slammed into the side armor of the Panzer IV. The physics of what happened next explain why the tactic worked, despite violating every principle of anti-tank design. An armor-piercing shell is meant to punch through a steel plate and detonate inside the vehicle. But the M7 was firing high-explosive rounds designed to burst on impact. When that massive shell detonated against the Panzer's armor instead of penetrating through it, the explosive force had to go somewhere. The explosion created an intense shockwave against the armor, which could damage internal components, and, in some cases, trigger fires or secondary explosions inside the vehicle. The Panzer IV erupted in a fireball. The explosion was so violent that the force of the explosion was so great that the turret was torn from the hull and thrown clear of the vehicle, spinning through the air before crashing upside down in the snow yards away from the burning hull. The German crew inside had no time to react, no chance to escape. One moment they existed, the next they simply didn't. The column ground to a halt. Commanders stood in turrets, staring in shock at the burning wreck. Radio nets erupted in confusion. This was the Germans' first shock, not just the destruction of their lead tank, but their inability to understand what had happened. The sound was wrong. The explosion was too massive. Artillery came from kilometers away with high arcing trajectories. This had been a flat, direct shot from an invisible position. The German tanks did what training dictated. They opened fire on the forest with machine guns and high explosive shells, searching desperately for the source of the attack. Panzer IVs raked the trees with their hull-mounted machine guns. Turret guns swiveled and fired, blasting apart pine trees and sending up fountains of snow and frozen earth. They were shooting at empty forest. The Americans had positioned too deep and camouflaged too well to be spotted by tankers, whose view was limited to periscopes and vision slits. While the Germans focused frantically on the left side of the road, a second M7, hidden on the right side in a completely different position, fired. Another boom, another screaming shell, another Panzer exploding in flames. Now German confusion transformed into something approaching panic. They were being hit from multiple directions. The forest seemed alive with enemies they couldn't see. Radio discipline started to break down as commanders shouted contradictory orders and demands for information no one could provide. What made this ambush so effective was the tactic the American crews were employing. An M7 would fire 1 or 2 shots from its carefully prepared position. While the Germans were still reeling, still searching for the source, and pouring fire into empty trees, the American crew would start their engine and quickly reverse deeper into the forest. The driver would maneuver through the dense pines, no easy task with a vehicle weighing over 22 tons, and relocate to a secondary position several hundred yards away that they had marked earlier. Meanwhile, another M7 would fire from its own concealed position, drawing German attention to a completely different part of the forest. By the time the Germans had saturated that area with fire, that M7 had moved, and the first gun, now repositioned, would fire again from a new location. And to the Germans, it must have seemed like they faced an entire battalion of phantom guns. Every direction held threats. Every thunderous boom announced another tank brewing up. A third Panzer was hit and exploded, its ammunition cooking off in secondary blasts. A fourth took damage that jammed its turret and set the engine compartment ablaze. The crew bailed out and ran for the trees, choosing to brave potential small arms fire rather than burn alive. A Stug 3 assault gun, despite its lower profile, was struck with a near-perfect hit that cracked its side armor and killed or wounded the crew inside. The Germans tried to respond. One tank attempted to rush forward, hoping to break through the ambush zone and escape down the road. It ran straight into another concealed M7 position and was destroyed at what might have been only 100 yards range, the shell hitting with such force that it partially flipped the 25-ton vehicle onto its side. German Panzer Grenadier infantry deployed to flank through the forest and locate the guns. But the dense trees slowed their advance, and the Americans had the .50 caliber machine guns mounted on their M7s, those pulpit mounts that gave the priest its nickname. Heavy machine gun fire forced the infantry to take cover or fall back with casualties. Calls for air support went unanswered. The weather was terrible, clouds and intermittent snow showers, and the Luftwaffe had few resources available in the sector anyway. For the American crews, the battle was a blur of practiced motions performed under conditions they'd never trained for. Loaders wrestled 33-pound shells continuously. Load, fire, load, fire! The gun barrel growing hot despite the freezing air. Gunners worked almost by instinct, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have faltered. Drivers navigated backward through forest they could barely see, trusting their commander's directions, praying they wouldn't hit a tree and hang up as a stationary target. The exact duration of the engagement is unclear, perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps an hour. Time distorts in combat. But by the time it ended, the German column had suffered devastating losses. Various accounts suggest possibly a dozen or more armoured vehicles were destroyed or disabled, though precise numbers are difficult to verify. The narrow road was blocked with burning wrecks. Ammunition cooked off inside hulls, sending rounds zinging in random directions. Black smoke mixed with white snow to create an infernal twilight. The German commander, whoever held that responsibility, made the only logical decision. He ordered withdrawal. Surviving vehicles either turned around on the narrow road or simply drove off into the forest itself. Infantry scattered into the trees, choosing the cold and possible capture over certain death. From their positions, the American artillery crews watched the Germans retreat. Some might have been too exhausted or shocked to celebrate. Others might have let out expressions of disbelief. They had expected to die after getting off maybe 1 or 2 shots. Instead, they had broken an elite Panzer column and survived. When American infantry advanced up that road the following day, they found a scene of destruction that must have seemed almost surreal. Burned-out German tanks and assault guns littered the narrow forest road, some with their turrets blown off, others bent at impossible angles from internal explosions. The snow around the wrecks was blackened with soot and oil. The smell of diesel fuel and burned metal hung in the cold air. The infantry officers were puzzled. They saw no evidence of American tank destroyers, no signs of Sherman tanks, nothing to explain the carnage. Only when they made contact with the artillery units did they learn the truth. This destruction had been wrought by weapons that weren't supposed to be able to fight tanks at all. The story spread almost immediately through both armies, among Americans with a sense of awed pride, among Germans with shaken disbelief that bordered on the superstitious. Some later stories and memories referred to the unseen guns around St. Vith as ghosts, a dramatic nickname that reflected the shock of those who faced the ambush. Invisible guns that fired from nowhere. American ingenuity turned desperate. St. Vith, which German planners had expected to capture by December 21st, held out until December 23rd. Those 48 extra hours mattered enormously in the context of the Battle of the Bulge, not as an abstract delay, but as real, usable time measured in convoys, road space, and command decisions. They helped preserve the limited time and road space that made it possible for the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to concentrate at Bastogne to the south, not as a dramatic rescue, but as an organized movement under pressure, not as a dramatic rescue, but as an orderly concentration of force. They permitted other units to form defensive lines, anchor artillery, and establish supply routes. They forced the Germans to commit additional resources to reducing the St. Vith salient, resources desperately needed elsewhere, where momentum was already slipping. For the Führer-Begleit Brigade specifically, the ambush had done more than destroy vehicles. It had damaged something harder to measure but equally important: confidence, the quiet belief that experience and equipment would always provide control. These were men who had believed themselves tactically and technologically superior to any American force, especially to support troops not intended for direct combat. Being humiliated by artillerymen using improvised tactics with the wrong weapon shook that confidence in ways that never appear in after-action reports, but shape hesitation, caution, and risk avoidance in later engagements, all of which reduce combat effectiveness. But the real question that later puzzled US Army analysts in post-war studies was why the tactic worked at all. Why did a weapon that was absolutely wrong for the job succeed in destroying an elite armored column, rather than simply failing as doctrine predicted? The answer mattered because it challenged basic assumptions about predictability on the battlefield and about how closely combat outcomes follow written manuals. The answer involved several factors working together. First, physics. At close range, 200 yards or less, that 33-pound shell carried tremendous kinetic energy, even at relatively slow velocity, and the gun crews understood this through experience rather than theory. When it detonated against armor instead of penetrating through it, the explosive force had nowhere to go except back into the metal itself. The overpressure could stress weld seams, damage armor joints, and transmit powerful shock waves through the vehicle, sometimes triggering ammunition fires or rupturing fuel systems. It was not elegant or efficient, but under the right conditions it was devastating. Second, terrain played a decisive role. The dense forest stripped away the Germans' advantages in visibility and engagement range, advantages on which their armored doctrine depended. The narrow road created a perfect kill zone where maneuver became almost impossible once the column was engaged. Where snow cover existed, it allowed effective white camouflage, which helped conceal movement and reduce the visibility of gun flashes in the forest. The Americans did not rely on general doctrine, they adapted their tactics precisely to the conditions of that place and that moment, turning weakness into temporary strength. Third, the shoot and scoot method created the illusion of overwhelming numbers. Each displacement reset German expectations and forced them to reassess while under fire. Hits came from different directions, and the pattern of fire led German crews to believe, at least temporarily, that they might be facing a larger and better distributed force than was actually present. The psychological effect of fighting unseen enemies amplified the physical damage, slowing reaction time and decision-making at the worst possible moment. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the Germans were mentally unprepared. They had trained to fight known weapons using known tactics, and their drills assumed familiar threats. An M7 priest firing direct fire at point-blank range existed completely outside their tactical doctrine, outside their expectations, and outside their mental model of danger. That cognitive shock may have been just as important as the explosions themselves. This becomes clearer when compared to what might have happened with proper weapons. An M10 tank destroyer, even with its more powerful gun, would likely have been spotted and targeted quickly. The Germans knew how to fight tank destroyers, and had practiced doing so. A platoon of Shermans would have faced Panzer IVs on roughly equal terms, but the Germans had extensive experience fighting Shermans, and might have prevailed through superior timing, coordination, or positioning. The M7 priests worked precisely because they were the wrong weapon. They achieved a level of surprise that the right weapons could not have produced, and once surprise was achieved, it reshaped the entire engagement. This does not mean the army rewrote its doctrine afterward. Official assessments acknowledged the action, but did not recommend using M7s as tank destroyers under normal circumstances. The consensus was that this had been a desperate improvisation that succeeded through a unique and temporary combination of factors that could not be reliably repeated. It was effective once, but it should not become standard practice. But the story became part of the Army's informal professional lore, passed quietly among officers as a lesson in adaptation rather than as a model to be repeated, passed down quietly as a professional lesson. It served as a reminder that adaptation and innovation sometimes matter more than doctrine, and that knowing when to break the rules can be just as important as knowing the rules themselves, especially in moments when there is no time left for perfect solutions. St. Vith eventually fell to the Germans, although by that point the offensive was beginning to slow in several sectors as resistance increased and supply problems emerged. Fuel shortages, stiffening resistance, and clearing weather that allowed Allied aircraft to return to the skies combined to doom Hitler's last gamble. By January 1945, the bulge was being steadily pushed back, and by late in the month, the front lines had largely returned close to their original positions. The American artillery crews who fought in that action do not appear to have received widespread recognition, and any official acknowledgement was limited or overshadowed by the larger battle, lost in the chaos of the larger battle. But they knew what they had accomplished. When given the wrong weapon in the wrong place at the wrong time, they had found a way to turn wrong into right. The lesson resonates beyond that specific moment in that specific forest. Many observers later saw this episode as an example of a broader pattern in warfare, where flexibility and individual initiative can sometimes matter more than strict adherence to doctrine. That rigid adherence to doctrine can be a weakness when circumstances fall outside the boundaries the doctrine was designed to cover. That individual initiative and creative problem-solving can overcome deficiencies in equipment or position. Sometimes the most important rule is knowing when to break the rules. The German Panzer crews who survived that day had learned a hard lesson. They had better equipment, more experience, and a longer military tradition. But they had been defeated by flexibility, creativity, and willingness to try something that shouldn't have worked. In that frozen Belgian forest, on that December morning in 1944, those qualities proved decisive. The M7 priests that fought at St. Vith returned to their normal role afterward, providing mobile artillery support for the remainder of the war. But their brief and unusual use as tank killers later became a story shared among veterans and in informal military circles, remembered more through personal accounts than through official doctrine, in the memories of those who were there or heard the tale from someone who was. Today, St. Vith is a peaceful Belgian town. The forests have long since healed their wartime scars, but the memory of the fighting remains today, reflected in local memorials and in stories passed down by some artillery veterans and historians, a reminder that when faced with impossible odds and inadequate tools, American soldiers have often found ways to make the impossible work. The Germans came expecting a predictable fight. They encountered something they couldn't have anticipated. Artillery pieces that hunted like predators, invisible positions that moved like ghosts, and American crews who refused to accept that their weapon couldn't do what needed to be done. In the end, the wrong gun in the right hands proved more effective than all the right guns in the wrong place. That is one way the story of St. Vith has been told, and it reflects how some participants and later writers understood the role of those unseen guns. And that's why, more than 80 years later, we still remember the day when a handful of American artillerymen wrote their own rules and proved that in war, as in life, impossible just means no one has done it yet. If you found this story of American ingenuity and determination compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the forgotten battles and unsung heroes of military history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things when it mattered most. And leave a comment below. Do you know of other battles where unconventional tactics turned the tide? Share your thoughts with our community of history enthusiasts.